Sorry, just bear with me. So can you guys see that?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay, so last session we focused on civil society in South Africa and examined the new social movements of the post-apartheid era and considered the continuing high levels of social protest despite the demobilization of these social movements. And among the debates we looked at were protest as participation and citizens as makers and shapers of policy through active participation. And in this session, we're going to look more closely at citizen participation, both formal and informal methods of participation. And we're going to look at how these link with debates on development. So in South Africa, we have what is called democratic local government. Well, our government's supposed to be democratic in general, but democratic local government. So this follows the transition to democracy in South Africa in 1994 and an end to the black local authorities. So the reason why local government is so important in this after the transition and in our new democratic South Africa is because it really was seen as replacing systems like the black local authorities. So systems that were illegitimate, that were imposed upon people. The new local government system was seen to be something completely different, representative of the people, able to link in a genuine fashion with the people, to be able to deal with their needs as closely as possible. So when you devolve like that, you're trying to get as close to those wards as you can. And also a way that government was accountable to these wards and residents in these wards, having that devolved leadership at local government. So local government was really seen as a very, very critical part of the transition. So the setting up of the democratic local government in South Africa, the idea was that there would be 3 tiers of government, as now I'm sure that you all know. We have national level, we have provincial level, we have local. And local supposed to be the closest to wards, to citizens, to communities, clearer lines of accountability, closer representation. And the setting up of democratic local government was envisaged in 2 quite specific pieces of legislation. So the Municipal Structures Act and the Municipal Systems Act of the late 90s and early 2000s. So the Structures Act provided for the new demarcations, so the new municipal demarcations. And these were based on equity. So as I'm sure you know, we have like category A type municipalities, which are the metropolitan areas like eThekwini, like Johannesburg, like Tshwane, like Port Elizabeth. And then we have local municipalities, which are smaller municipalities. And then we have district municipalities, which may cover a group of local municipalities. So the idea of these demarcations was for equity, to share resources amongst these municipalities and to allow for cross-subsidization. The Structures Act also was how councils and electing mayors, etc., how those municipal structures were set up. These were all governed by the Structures Act. Also, the setting up of the local government electoral system. So as you know, we have local government elections in South Africa, and then we have separate elections for national and provincial elections. So local government elections where you would elect a councillor according to the PR system, the proportional representation system, but you'd also be able to select a councillor in your ward. So this is one of the ways that this accountability and this proximity to citizens and residents in wards was supposed to be enabled. So this would facilitate genuine representation. Moving on now to the Systems Act. So the Systems Act focused more on mechanisms and processes for community participation. So for example, this was how ward councillors and ward committees were supposed to work. Also the IDP, the integrated development plan that every municipality is supposed to have. So this act, the Systems Act, focused on mechanisms for the provision of services to ensure that all members of the local community or that ward have access to at least the minimum level of basic municipal services. So let's look more closely at these mechanisms and processes that were supposed to facilitate participation. Because if you look at these two pieces of legislation, they are really progressive. It's you know, it really looks good on paper that participatory local government is very much in play in paper. On those two pieces of legislation are really quite incredible. They are beautifully conceived. Whether they've worked out in a practical sense has been the subject of much debate. So ward councillors, there've been a number of critiques around ward councillors, and I've come across many of these firsthand talking to protesters, because, you know, protest is local level. Usually grievances are directed towards local authorities. People very rarely when I've interviewed protesters, people have, and also from other studies of other protest studies in South Africa, people will rarely talk about grievances with the ANC or with national or provincial level. The grievances are directed at local level. So some of the critiques around ward councillors is, well, and one that's obvious, I suppose, is how much impact really do they have on decision making? So when are they communicating grievances back? Perhaps they are, but are these being translated into policy when it moves up the scale? You know, how much effect are what ward councillors saying? What sort of effect does it have? Another criticism of ward councillors has been that they are beholden to their parties rather than to their constituencies. So if they are part of the ANC, they are not particularly interested in promoting the interests of people in their ward who might not be sort of card-carrying members of the ANC. So these sorts of questions have been leveled around ward councillors. When I did some research just around the corner here at Cato Manor, another thing that came up, and it comes up often, where people are feeling that ward councillors are just doing the job, going through the motions, and also that ward councillors are in fact involved in corruption. In Cato Crest, one of the protesters told me that the RDP houses were, okay, so this is exactly how he put it, which I thought was quite interesting. He said that the eThekwini mayor is sitting in his wood-paneled office, scratching his head and wondering why there's so many squatters and so many shacks in Cato Crest, because there have been so many houses built there in Cato Manor. But the problem is that the houses are not being given to people who live in the shacks. The houses are being given to people who pay for them. And the person they're paying is the ward councillor. And apparently the ward councillor is even happy to issue receipts for these houses that he's illegally handing over to people for a fee, obviously. So accused of corruption. Ward committees, there have also been a number of criticisms around ward committees. These range from simply that they're not constituted properly. So they're supposed to represent community interests. Members should be representative of the community, in other words. But often they are serving narrow interests. Often they're used as political platforms to push interests and agendas of specific parties, especially around elections and voting time. But they're also used as a source of political patronage. So you will have a sense of belonging on that committee, or what you say will be taken seriously on that committee if you are seen as loyal to a certain party. So these are some of the problems around the ward committees. When I interviewed protesters, a number of them also said to me that, well, actually, there are no ward committees here. Nobody ever holds ward committee meetings. If we didn't get together as a community, and it's usually to complain about things, the community would never meet. So the community is meeting under the auspices of community organization. There's no such thing as a ward committee. We've never had one here. You know, people say, as long as I've lived here, we've never had a ward committee meeting. So these are some of the problems around these formal methods of participation that look so good in theory, but have not worked out practically. So another participatory mechanism is the integrated development plans, which are supposed to be adopted by each municipality. And IDPs are supposed to outline a long-term development plan. And participatory processes are key to ensuring community and local input into IDPs. So these include things like presenting at community meetings, traveling to wards, meeting with various stakeholders. That's how an IDP is supposed to be put into process. But the IDP process, again, is fraught with what Richard Ballard has called the politics of participation. And the reason that I've included that first reading in your readings, and the reason why I've kept it there, is because it was one of the first critiques of local level participation, and it's quite nice in the sense that it's the critique of the eThekwini municipality. So what is this politics of participation? Competition for formal representation around development initiatives. So whose agenda is going to prevail? Who has a say? Who will be listened to most closely? So here I'm talking about influence of various networks, their influence on policy formulation, influence, for example, of big business, and community meetings being less about listening to communities and residents and more about what the authors call communicating a series of municipality norms and values. So communities are now conditioned into understanding what the norms and values are. So they will re-articulate their needs within these norms and values. Okay, so think about some of the things we talked about when we talked about counter-hegemonic struggles and we talked about Antonio Gramsci. If a community meeting is set up to make it very clear how you should be thinking about services, then you're going to define and frame your needs within those parameters because you're being told that this is how things are done. Another thing that these meetings were used to do were to temper expectations. So often citing lack of resources, municipality would say what is possible, what isn't possible. Like the example that I gave yesterday of residents in a peri-urban ward being told that they would never have flush toilets. So they would either have to put up with a UDI system or they would build their own pit latrines. So this idea of what's possible, what isn't possible, and put your expectations well within our frame of what we are able to deliver, or in some cases, what we want to deliver. So more broadly, participation is used to reinforce existing power relations. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. And there are also other power tensions, various other power tensions, for example, ward councillors, issues around officials versus politicians, tensions with regards minority party councillors and officials, and tensions between traditional leaders and officials. So when I've spoken to people in rural areas and they've said to me that they have no intention of ever engaging, for example, with their ward councillor. They would rather engage with traditional leader because they feel that that is a more legitimate representation of their interests. So all of those tensions are also playing out within the IDP process and putting together IDP plans. Now, added to being participatory, local government in South Africa was also tasked with being developmental, this idea of developmental local government. So essentially, local government must work with citizens and communities to find ways to meet their social, economic, and material needs. At the time when the RDP was still in fashion and still the thing that the ruling party was rolling out, local government was described as the hands and the feet of the RDP. So the idea was that it was supposed to provide services and it was supposed to facilitate local economic development. So the development project was basically devolved to the local level. But we also know that cities, for example, were later tasked with competing globally. So this idea of participating in the global economy, cities were seen as drivers of economic growth. So there's this disparity between being pro-poor and facilitating economic growth. So an example would be FIFA, what has been called FIFA, THIEFA, the World Cup that was hosted in South Africa. So these stadia were built at great expense. We heard all sorts of stories about how it was going to create employment, but there were all sorts of politics around and corruption around that employment. The employment was also short-term. These stadia have been of little value sort of post that event. And the other thing that happened was in this sort of drive to clean up, quote unquote, clean up the cities, street traders and fisher folk were displaced. So these are people who earn their livelihoods from being in a certain place, being at the Durban Harbour to fish, for example, or being in Durban CBD to do, to trade, to do small kinds of tradings and ways of earning a living. And folks like these were the first to be displaced. So there was definitely, it was the poorest and the most marginalized that were hit first, with something like cities wanting to be drivers of economic growth through initiatives like hosting FIFA. Okay, so how does participatory and developmental local government translate into the broader debates on participation and development? What is the link? In the 1980s and 90s, participation was an emerging trend in development projects. So it was very fashionable to include beneficiaries in the design of development initiatives. And the idea behind this was that the development initiative would better reflect the needs of the people that it was supposed to be aiding. It would also give the project a sense of legitimacy, so you would have buy-in from the beneficiaries. But it also served the global neoliberal economic agenda of rolling back the state and giving citizens, residents, more responsibility. So it served that need. By the 1990s and 2000s, there were a number of critiques around the nature and quality of participation. So these included the argument that participation was the new tyranny. So here I'm referring to the book by Hickey Mohan, the book by Participation, it was called Participation, the New Tyranny by Cook and Kothari. And it was followed up by the Hickey Mohan book, Participation from Tyranny to Transformation. We're going to get there now. So this idea of participation as tyranny argued that including people or talking about participatory methods was a way of binding people further into poverty or co-opting them into a predetermined development agendas. So it was just another way of keeping them under control, if you like. So questions around what constitutes genuine participation were asked at this time, and people started referring again to a very famous ladder of participation, which you might have come across. It's called the Arnstein's ladder of participation, which depicts weak versus strong participation. So I'm going to just move to the next slide so that you can have a look at the ladder, and I'll deal with the third point just now. Okay, so this letter is by Sherry Arnstein. It's a really old letter. It's 1969, and of course there've been a number of critiques of it. There've been a number of ways in which it has been built on to better reflect the times or the context. But the context of this letter was a response to the piecemeal approach of citizen participation on urban renewal in the States. And this was towards the end of the American civil rights struggle. And Sherry Arnstein has been quoted as saying that if she knew it was going to be so well used and so quoted and cited, then she would have perhaps thought about it differently and done it a bit differently. So I still feel that it is a very useful way to understand genuine participation. And I think that this is something, that's applicable across the board. We can even talk about it in terms of how we teach and how we learn, right? So let's talk a little bit about it. There, if you were in class, there would be another column. So the first column is the rung. The second column is the form of participation. And then the third column would be an example. And if we were in a physical space in class, I would have made you guys come up with examples for all of these. But as it is today, I'm just going to give you examples. So I'm sorry. I know that's boring and not very challenging, but it's just 2020. Right, so there are 8 rungs to this ladder, as you see. I'm going to start at the bottom. The bottom of the rung, so this is the worst kind of participation, is what the ladder refers to as manipulation. So here you would have citizens involved in a process, but they're not really able to have any control of it. It's not intended that they will have any control of it. The idea is to have them there to provide legitimacy, to gain support, to disseminate information, often just to check a box to say, yes, you've consulted, whatever that means. So an example of that would be citizens placed on rubber stamp advisory committees. The rung above that I'm going to move to now is therapy. So here, the idea is to get people to adjust their values and attitudes. Citizens would be brought in, but what would be discussed would be their own pathologies. So the spotlight would be turned back onto them, distracting them from the real causes or sources of the problem. So an example here would be bringing citizens together and saying, well, you've got to do a cleanup campaign in your neighborhood, but it's something that you've got to be responsible for. All those narratives of take responsibility for yourselves, like clean up your neighborhoods, which is not a bad thing, but it's also a way to shift things back onto the citizen, as opposed to providing a larger service. It allows you to do less and to place the burden back onto the citizen. So rungs 8, 7, and 8 are what Sherry Arnstein regards as non-participation. So that's not really participation. Moving now up a rung to 6, this is informing. Here there's a one-way flow of information. So citizens would be informed of the project and what's going on, of their rights and responsibilities. There would be no real engagement. There would be no chance for negotiations. So very little opportunity for citizens to influence the process. So an example of this would be the Masakane campaign. And that was a campaign in South Africa that was supposed to try to get citizens to get them out of this culture of non-payment. Remember yesterday we talked a little bit about this culture of non-payment related to service delivery, because local authorities viewed this as the problem. People were not paying for services because there's this culture of non-payment. There's this sense of entitlement. There's this boycotting of service payments that comes from the apartheid days, but we no longer have apartheid. We're a democracy now. Everybody must pay. And a lot less emphasis or focus or wanting to recognize that people are too poor to make those bills, right? So that's the Masakane campaign. much less, more of a focus on you have a responsibility as a democratic citizen to pay your rates and to pay your bills, and much less of a focus on your rights, to your social rights as a South African, right? That's the kind of informing campaign. Moving up a rung to consultation. So here, power holders have gone through the motions of involving people, participating in participation, but there's no guarantee that citizens consulted will have their views taken very seriously, or that their grievances will be translated into anything impactful. So I suppose an example here could be some of the critiques that were made around the IDP, where communities and groups inputted or were part of the consultation process, but then what came out of it spoke very little to their particular context, whereas big business would have been allocated for in a way that they wouldn't have been. So participating in participation, full stop. Moving to the fourth rung now, application. So here, citizens are allowed to plan, but power holders retain the right to decide. So power holders are still the ones making the final decision. So I suppose an example here would be ward committees, right? Citizens would be given the floor, and then it would be up to the ward committee chair or the politics and the officials of it who decide what to take further, or what to take seriously, right? And what to incorporate into changing policy or affecting policy. So these three rungs, 4, 5, and 6, are what Sherry Arnstein refers to as tokenism. So the idea is that there is participation, but it's tokenistic. It's very much more for show. Okay, then moving on to rung 3, partnership. So here there is more shared responsibility of power. So citizens would be allowed to negotiate. Citizens would be involved at some level of the decision making, and they would be part of the project at higher levels. So some form of partnership. So I suppose an example of this would be where there is an organized power base in the community, where communities have access to finances, where they can choose services or contractors, for example. And I guess that this is why it's so important to build strong neighborhood committees. Some of the things that Marjan Sedar was talking about when he did his webinar on the Black Lives Matter movement. Also the kinds of things that social movements like the Treatment Action Campaign has been trying to promote for the last few years, where communities need to self-mobilize around health issues, whether or not there's a social movement to prompt them on, or for them to come under an umbrella status of. So this is why it's important for that sort of community strength, for what some of the protesters that I had interviewed called abahlali, active citizens, why it's important to build those in communities. Because this is leading up to citizen power, right? These last top three rungs of the ladder are what Sherry Arnstein refers to as citizen power, moving towards genuine citizen power. Moving up to the second rung, delegated power. So here would be when citizens are holding significant power, right? So there's a very clear line of accountability to them. So this would be where a community has a majority voice, for example, on a board, or have a very distinct say in the planning of a program. And then moving up to the first rung, citizen control. So citizen control would be where citizens are actually in charge of the program or organization or body, and they are able to control and access finances. They are able to take on the managerial capacity. So an example would be the very powerful neighborhood corporations. Then, of course, we may want to ask questions around this. Is it a good thing? Is there such a thing as too much citizen power? So we've seen various critiques of what ward councillors do when they're in power. What about community groups who have certain interests? You could argue, well, as long as it serves the community, they have a right to those interests. But again, that's a debate. So that's something to think about at the top rung, citizen control. How much citizen power is good and how much is bad? Okay, so contemporary thinking around participation debates advocates for a radical transformative approach to participation. So more lately, approaches to participation argue that even the most marginal actors can reinvent their own sites of participation. And this is the way in which they're going to have their interests addressed. So the roots of this are in the philosophy of Paulo Freire. I don't know if you guys have heard of Paulo Freire. He wrote something very famous called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is relevant for teaching and learning, especially in our context, where Paulo Freire argued that your student is not an empty vessel. So you guys are not empty vessels that I'm supposed to fill up with knowledge. You guys are co-creators of knowledge. And when I am quote unquote teaching, should I be, there's this debate around teaching versus facilitating. What am I teaching? Am I teaching my students to be part of the system, which may oppress my students? Or am I giving them the tools with which to engage with this oppressive situation? And so to create transformation, right? So the pedagogy of the oppressed is asking us to really dissect how we teach and what we're doing and how we, how we are, not just how we, am I just relaying a whole bunch of information to you, or am I giving you the opportunity to co-produce knowledge and to develop it in your own context, right? So drawing from these sorts of philosophies, participation is seen as part of a process of becoming more fully human or liberated. So participation is intended to enable people to define or redefine their own development. This is the point of participation, genuine participation. So participation is not to determine the direction of projects that have already been conceived by the municipality, by the development initiative, or more broadly, the neoliberal economic framework that it operates in. That's not the point of genuine participation. So then where does this participation happen? The concept of space is useful to understand the dynamics of participatory processes. And here I'm drawing from the Andrea Cornwell work, Faranak Mariftab, when they talk about invited and invented spaces of participation. And I have touched on this yesterday when I spoke about the Umlazi Occupy. So an invited space would be a space legitimized by government, by donors. An example would be ward committee meetings, some of the IDP consultation processes. These are spaces in which citizens are invited. It's a formal space. An invented space, on the other hand, would be occupied by people who are marginalized. And they may perhaps have access to invited spaces, but they consider them illegitimate, or perhaps they don't exist. Like some of the critiques that were made around the ward committees. People felt excluded from the ward committees because they felt that those represented narrow interests. Sometimes ward committees didn't exist at all. And so it was appropriate to move into invited spaces. So invited spaces aim to cope or adapt to the situation. Invented spaces are characterized by defiance or resisting the status quo. But the two spaces are not in a binary relationship. They can exist in parallel. Action can move between them depending on the situation and which suits needs better. So an example, I think I already gave you an example yesterday of the Umlazi Occupy, where protesters occupied the ward councillor's office. And so it was, what they did was they set up, the ward council's office was a container. In front of the container was an open area. But there were lots of trees and plants and things in that area. So they cut down some of those plants and they set up a tent, and they called that the people space. So in that sense, they were in their invented space, the people space. But when the councillor was recalled and the ward committee reconstituted, then they themselves moved in to sit on that committee. So they moved from the invited space into the invented space. But for them, it was a seamless move because they had already created the people space. And now this was just a way of extending the people's reach, if you like. So why is understanding the use of spaces in this way important? Because it shows that civil society is not simply characterized by actors who participate in the formal, sanctioned by the state, but also by actors in the informal. And often these actors are discredited or delegitimized, as I gave some examples yesterday of some of the social movement participants who were criminalized in terms of some of their methods, destroying prepaid meters, reconnecting to electricity, reconnecting to water supplies to obtain services for free. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there for today.